Good morning and welcome back to another episode of the Red Chip Poker Podcast. Coach Weasel is going to be leading today's conversation, but I want to pop in real quick, say hello and good morning, and also invite you to check out our Black Friday discounts. But I don't want to make this a long intro, so I'm just going to say go to redchippoker.com/black, B-L-A-C-K, redchippoker.com/black to check out everything we got for Black Friday. I think you're really going to dig some of the options in there. Check it out today, and I can't wait to see what you think, and also pick up exactly what's right for you in your game right now. So again, redchippoker.com/black, check it out, and without further ado, let's get into today's episode. Here's Coach Weasel.
What's up guys, welcome to the Red Chip Poker Podcast. The title of this episode is Poker Cheats. We're going to be talking about the different ways that players try and cheat in online poker. Now we might think, why are we making this information available? Couldn't someone potentially use this information to try and cheat at the game? Well, yes, they could. But the best defense against this is not to try and conceal this information, but rather to make it freely available to everyone so they can educate themselves on the different types of cheating that might be taking place in the games that you're playing. We're going to start on the topic of poker bots. Bots have been around for a long time. In fact, for almost as long as there has been online poker, there has been online poker bots. As an example of this, if you Google search for the 2+2 thread with the title Huge iPoker Bot Ring, you'll find a bot ring I uncovered over 10 years ago. And I go into detail in the thread how the bot ring worked. Prior to uncovering this particular bot ring, I wouldn't say I was aware of the fact that there were non-human players at some of the online poker tables. But after playing against this group of players for a period of time, I inferred that these must in fact be non-human players. Now these particular bots, they are what I'd refer to as a profile bot, which is one step up from the primitive type of poker bot you might run into. So a primitive bot just plays a very basic strategy. Depending on the games, it might be just about enough to turn a positive win rate, but the majority of bots are in fact losing players, and the slightly better bots usually turn a small profit after rakeback, but in terms of direct win rate, the average bot is losing. This is not always the case, by the way. There are stories of fairly high-profile bots taking millions from some of the mid and high-stakes games, but most bots struggle to make money at the lower limit games, especially the primitive bots. Now, what I ran into at iPoker was a type of bot known as a profile bot. So this particular group of bots would actually track the statistics of players at the table and would launch exploits based on those stats. In other words, if you were to play against this ring of bots and you were to fold a lot to 3-bets, that bot ring would start 3-betting you very aggressively. If you were to fold too much to 4-bets, they would start 4-betting you very aggressively. Now, this was 10 years ago. These bots weren't great, and there were ways that you could easily exploit these bots. Imagine if you managed to get them 4-betting any two cards against you, and then you could just print money by min 5-betting, and the bot automatically folds because it hasn't been programmed to continue against a 5-bet with the weakest hands in its exploitative 4-bet bluff range. You can start printing money very quickly against badly designed bots. By the way, bot owners know this type of thing, and there's often a kill switch mechanism where they can shut down action against specific types of players. So if at the end of the day or the week, the bot owner sees he's been hemorrhaging money against a specific opponent, he can simply configure his bot not to give action against that player, unless maybe he has a premium like kings or aces, for example. Now, the other interesting thing about this bot ring that I uncovered was that when it got to the situation where one of the bots was, let's say, folding every single time I would min 5-bet, it wasn't just that one bot that was folding. In fact, all of the suspected bots in the bot ring were now 4-betting any two cards and then folding to a min 5-bet. So how did a player who I've never played against know to 4-bet any two cards and then fold to a min 5-bet when we have no history? Well, that bot's obviously been given data by the other bots in the player pool. And that's what we mean by a bot ring. A series of bots working together, sharing data. So not only is this botting, it's actually a type of collusion, which we'll talk about a little bit later in this podcast episode. Of course, in modern times, players are especially concerned about a new type of bot, which is the GTO bot. And again, we'll talk about that a little bit later in this podcast episode. Let's move on to our next topic, which is the super user. The idea behind a super user is that he can see our hole cards. Imagine trying to beat an opponent who knows exactly which hole cards we have. It's virtually impossible. Now, we might think that such a user doesn't exist, but unfortunately, history would prove us wrong there. Why not try researching the Absolute Poker and Ultimate Bet scandal of 2008? The short version of the story is that one of the site employees had access to all hole card information and was able to spin up quite a large amount of profits by making use of this information at the tables. Now, this particular user did so in a way that wasn't intelligent. In fact, one of the usernames involved was an alias Pot Ripper. And this guy was doing stuff that you would never do if you were any kind of intelligent cheater. Things like making huge hero calls with Jack High when you knew your opponent was bluffing. It becomes super obvious super quickly that you have access to information that you shouldn't. In other words, it's possible to spot someone who is a super user if they don't go about their cheating in a way that flies below the radar. This is what happened in the Pitbull Poker super user scandal of 2009. Now, most of you will not have heard of this. The reason why I mention this is because it's one that affected me specifically. I had a no deposit bonus. I think it was probably something like $10 or $25. And somehow, amidst a whole bunch of super users, managed to spin the amount up to several $100. But at the time, there were allegations appearing on 2plus2. And of course, it's a forum. You can still see the original posts to do with Pitbull Poker. There were allegations that there were super users sitting at the table. How did they know? It was based on their playstyle. Similar to the Absolute Poker and Ultimate Bet scandal, the playstyle didn't make sense. It was obvious that some of these players were making hero calls that no one would ever make. Anyway, one day, as I came to log in to my Pitbull Poker account, there was a message that the domain had been seized and the owner of Pitbull Poker had apparently been sent to jail. In other words, the whole site was a scam. And presumably the idea was simply to get users to deposit their money and then cheat them out of it by having access to their hole cards without them realizing it. If there's one takeaway from this, it's that your hole cards are not necessarily secret. There's probably someone somewhere who has the ability to access your hole cards. Now, we of course hope that that is a legitimate security person who is not corrupt and not interested in trying to cheat you out of your money. But the point is, even on high-profile sites, this type of thing can potentially happen. So if something doesn't feel right, there is a chance that it's not right. Of course, the flip side to that, which can sometimes color our judgment, is that poker is a game of high variance. There will be periods of time where our opponents are making somewhat incredulous hero calls down against us. And we might suspect that maybe we're dealing with super users when in fact it's just variance or a combination of variance and calling station opponents. Either way, keep in mind the security of your hole cards is not necessarily fully in your own hands. And there have been modern attempts to find a solution to this. For example, leveraging the blockchain so that there is no one else on the planet that knows your hole cards apart from you. But so long as we're playing on a regular site that's not making use of any kind of blockchain technology, there is the chance that your hole card information could be available in real time to a corrupt individual. And as an extension of that, this individual that has access to your hole card information, well, there's a chance that it doesn't need to be a human player. We could combine the previous form of cheating with the ability to see all hole cards, and we end up with a housebot. Now, housebots have been used to arbitrarily boost the traffic on certain poker networks. And in situations where this has been done, poker sites are notoriously reluctant to provide any kind of information in terms of whether they are using Housebots and what exactly these Housebots do. One of the objectives of a poker site is obviously to provide traffic in whichever format their user wants to play. So it's obviously not that appealing to a user if they log on, they want to play some 200NL online, and there's zero traffic at the limit the user wants to play. Or even if it's lower limits, if there's no traffic, how can the user play? So what might an online casino decide to do? Introduce Housebots. These are essentially bots run by the poker room itself. Just think about this for a minute. Can you prove that every opponent that you play against on a day-to-day basis is a human player and not a bot? Now, I just want to be very clear here. The objective is not to make any kind of allegations. I certainly don't have any evidence for that. It's just to think logically about some of the information that we don't fully have access to. Take the current world's largest online poker site. You'll probably know which site that I'm talking about. And it's developed from a somewhat obscure, very shady network into the world's largest online poker room. And it's clearly surpassed that other poker room, which had the #1 spot for quite a number of years previous to that. Is all of that traffic legitimate? Now, I by no means know the answer, but there has been discussions on the RedChip Discord regarding very suspicious looking users in the fast format pool. And what I mean by suspicious is a very specific and very unlikely player profile. And I'm talking about someone who has a 3-bet frequency larger than the PFR frequency. So imagine a player who has a PFR of 9%, but has a 3-bet frequency of 20%, for example. That's not a common player type. In fact, before playing on this specific network, I'm not sure I'd ever seen a player who has a 3-bet frequency higher than his PFR frequency over a large sample size. In fact, I even had to stop and think, is this even possible? Is this an error in terms of the way the stats are being displayed? But when you think about it, it is possible for a user to have a higher 3-bet frequency than their PFR frequency. This would be a user who hardly ever open raises, but loves to 3-bet really aggressively against opens. Just so you know, no one really plays like that, at least not historically. So when you're in a fast format pool, and you see this type of player profile showing up everywhere, we mean 50, 100 plus guys, all playing with this strange style of a 3-bet frequency much higher than the PFR frequency, well, now we stop and think, these guys must be affiliated somehow. This is not a coincidence. Either they're all part of some kind of weird poker training school that we don't know about that just exists in a certain part of the world, or these guys are up to something. And if it's not an organization of bots run by an external organization, well, what option does that leave? It leaves the option of Housebots. Again, the objective here is not to make any kind of allegation that I have no proof of. It's just something that's interesting to think about. Do we really know how much of the traffic is legitimate in some of the bigger online poker rooms? And of course, the very worrying thing about Housebots is that if they are operated by the room, well, they're not going to get kicked out by the room, and also means they could potentially have access to hole cards. Now, I haven't really seen anything to indicate that there are groups of players that have access to hole card information, so I don't believe that. What would be another way that someone could prevent a bot from losing too much money against the pool? Well, it would be to have arbitrarily high rake. You could even run bots at higher limits if that was the case. So long as the rake was high enough, it wouldn't matter too much if a specific player had an edge against one of your Housebots, because ultimately the rake that the room is going to take is going to outweigh the amount that gets lost by the Housebot. Again, we're not implying anything here, just something to think about, how easy it is to potentially cheat if you were so inclined, not just as a player, but also as a poker room. Now, on the topic of hole card cheating, something that's also happened in the history of high-stakes online poker is what we can refer to as hole card cheating. Basic setup is this. You perhaps pretend to be some kind of coach. You offer to rail another user. You're helping them make strategic decisions, so you can see all of their whole card information in real time. But in fact, you've maybe joined that table as another account. You have access to that player's whole card information. You're telling that player what to do. Hey, shove all in this spot. This is a good bluff spot. You actually have something that can call against that all-in shove. You can see how easy it would be to convince someone to potentially share their screen with you and get access to their whole card information. So just a word of warning here. You want to make sure that you completely trust someone that you're sharing your screen with, or alternatively, don't show them sensitive information. If you don't 100% trust someone, then don't show them your whole card information while you're playing live. There could be other ways of accessing whole card information as well. No site is immune to the possibility of being hacked. A site could legitimately get hacked. Now we have super users that have nothing to do with the site itself, but they've managed to compromise the site's security. If even government agencies can get hacked, then believe it that a poker room could get hacked as well. The next topic is collusion, and we've talked about this to some extent already because we've spoken about colluding bot rings that share profile information on their opponents. The basic idea behind collusion is two or more players working together on the same table. Now, a fairly naive implementation of this could be that you are playing, your buddy is on the same table as you, and you are chatting over a Skype call or a Zoom call, and you're working together to try and beat the other players at the table. Of course, this is completely against the rules. The advantage of doing this is maybe not as big as you might think, since most players don't really understand how they would technically make use of collusion to confer an advantage. Now, another form of collusion, and I would say this is a fairly soft form of collusion, but it is technically cheating, is ghosting. And it's where you have a strong player give you advice in real time. So it could be something simple like you are working with a coach and you are playing online while you're being railed, and the coach is giving you information in terms of what plays you should be making, and it's giving a drastic boost to the quality of your game. Now, this may be something you've done before, perhaps even innocently. It is technically against the rules. And that's why if you are working with a coach while playing live, the coach shouldn't really give you advice until after the hand. Otherwise, it's a type of cheating. Another similar type of cheating, which not really that serious, but again, is against the rules, is soft playing. You see your buddy, and instead of shoving all in on the river with the nuts, you decide to just call because you don't want to take a bunch of chips from your buddy. It's against the rules and can actually get you in trouble at the site you're playing in. Now, humans are fairly bad at using collusion to their advantage, but a well-programmed bot is not. And we see a potential example of this, again, at the iPoker network. And we're not necessarily talking about the current state of things, we're talking about how things were in the past. Like we said, the goal here is not to make any allegations against certain poker rooms, just to make you aware of this information. There was a site that liked to run independent audits of the RNG of certain poker rooms. And by the way, this is something that all poker rooms have to do anyway as part of the law. If you're offering some kind of gambling service, there needs to be an audit for your RNG. Of course, technically, there might not be a lot to stop a room swapping out their RNG for the purposes of the audit and then using a rigged RNG for the players. That's probably not what happens in most cases, but for this particular independent audit, iPoker was getting some really strange results for all-in situations. In fact, for all intents and purposes, iPoker appeared to be rigged when players were going all in. Certain types of hands were not holding up as much as they should. Now, is this because they had a problem with their RNG? Well, that's one possibility, but here's another possibility. Imagine there was widespread collusion in the form of bot rings at a specific network. And one of the things that these bot rings are going to be able to do is share whole card information with each other when they're making pre-flop decisions. So imagine as the bot, you're deciding whether you should go all in with your ace king in a certain situation. Well, the best play might depend on how many aces and kings there are left in the deck. And if you receive information from your bot buddies and one of them's folded an ace, another one's folded a king, Well, things don't look so good for getting all in with your ace-king because you know that there are less aces and kings left in the deck. In other words, because of the extra card removal information, it would technically be possible to improve the quality of your pre-flop decisions as a bot ring. This means that from an external viewpoint, it would seem like the hands of the bot ring were winning more often than they should be. So at the time when the iPoker independent audit failed the RNG test, is that what was going on? We certainly know that there were large bot rings operating at the network at that time. That could certainly provide an explanation for the appearance of riggedness of the RNG. Okay, let's talk about some other types of cheating where the objective is not necessarily to try and win at the poker tables. So one of them is obviously money laundering. And a big part of the objective here is simply to dump a whole bunch of chips to another player. So it can obviously get a bit suspicious if there are repeated large player-to-player transfers, only for the recipient to cash out those funds immediately. So the objective is to make it look like those funds were legitimately lost to the recipient. Now, in most cases, this won't affect you directly, but it's worth keeping in mind that when a player is trying to disguise their chip dumping activity, they'll dump the majority of it to the intended recipient, but they'll also deliberately dump chips to innocent third parties, just to give the impression that the movement of funds is random and that there is not a specific recipient. So sometimes what can happen is you receive a large chip dump from someone who is laundering money. You then find your account frozen or your account having to go through additional security checks because the room has flagged you as being part of this illegal chip dumping operation. So it's just worth keeping that in mind. If you notice suspicious activity and you think it might be chip dumping, it's recommended to report it to the room because at least that way you free yourself of any potential implication in the involvement of that illegal activity. Let's now talk about angling or angle shooting. The objective here is to misuse the way that online poker works to gain an unfair advantage. An example of this is grimming. So if you think about win rates in heads-up poker, the button always wins and the big blind always loses. Or at least the vast majority of the time. That's how things are. Now, of course, the reason why good players win is that they win even more when they're on the button and they lose a bit less when they're in the big blind. But generally, even winning players are going to lose money in the big blind. Now, imagine you weren't a very good heads-up player, but you could set up a situation where you play way more buttons than you do big blinds. So as an example, you sit down at a heads-up table. If you are dealt onto the button, you play one hand, then you leave the table. If you're dealt into the big blind, you play the big blind, then you play the button, then you leave the table. Over a large sample, you're going to be playing way more buttons than you are big blinds. And even if you're not very good, you could potentially make a lot of money. This is an angling technique known as grimming. Completely illegal, by the way. If you do this, you're probably going to get your account frozen. But of course, it depends on how with it the security team are. If the security team is not very good, you could potentially get away with making a lot of money with this specific method of cheating. Once again, the best protection against this is if you feel that you have been grimmed by a certain opponent, just report it to the security team. Another example of an angle is disconnect abuse. So sites used to offer this feature where if you got disconnected while in the middle of a hand, rather than timing you out and forcing you to fold, it would allow you to just fully realize your equity. It would just pause the action, it wouldn't allow any further bets, it would deal the turn and river card, and then if you won, you'd win your share of what's already in the pot. If you lost, you would just lose like normal. But this actually confers a big advantage because there are certain types of hands that might really struggle to get to showdown. Imagine you're in a situation where you've 3-bet pre-flop with pocket aces and the flop comes something really terrible for your aces, but you really want to get to showdown and you don't want to have to face bets from your opponent in order to reach showdown. Well, what do you do in that situation? You just switch off your router. There we go. Come back a couple of minutes later and you get to see the full results of the hand without having had to invest any additional chips in a bad situation. Another example of an angle occurs in MTTs, and if you've played MTTs, not that I'm a big MTT player, but you'll have seen this type of activity. And the idea is we're getting fairly close to the bubble. There are obviously a bunch of guys with short stacks, and they figure if they just use up their entire minute-and-a-half time bank every time, they'll hopefully get to the situation where they pass the bubble without having to invest any additional chips. And this can become quite extreme, where you're on a table with 10 players and 8 of the 10 players are using a full minute time bank. So it can literally take you 8 minutes to play a single hand. This is obviously not what the time bank is intended for. It's a type of angle shooting. Now, to some extent, hand-for-hand play solves this problem, because if you are in hand-for-hand play in an MTT, there's no point trying to time out, because it just means you're holding up the entire tournament if you do that, because no one's going to get dealt an additional hand until every table in the tournament has completed its current hand. But of course, the whole tournament is not hand-for-hand play, and leading up to the hand-for-hand play, which usually occurs around the bubble, is the time when everyone starts making use of the MTT time waste angle shoot. Okay, let's now talk about real-time assistance, which is really the big form of cheating that most players are concerned about in the modern game. Now, there are different types of RTA. The first is manual real-time assistance. And what that means is you don't have a bot, you simply have a pre-solved solution available that you can manually click through as you play poker. Now, it's fairly hard for a site to defend against this because the signature is not as obvious as bot real-time assistance. So bot real-time assistance, well, we basically just mean a bot which is following a solver strategy. The key difference here is manual RTA is really slow. Imagine having to click through a solution for every single spot of every single hand. You're not going to play many hands per hour. You're probably going to end up making a lot of mistakes. You'll probably fly below the site's radar. You might even make some money, but it's a really slow, inefficient way of trying to cheat. Now, bot real-time assistance is a much bigger problem because a bot can much more easily play multiple tables and play many more hands per hour. And of course, a bot doesn't really make mistakes. It's going to be able to get those GTO frequencies almost perfect. The bad news for the bot owner is these methods of cheating carry a much stronger signature. In other words, it's going to be a lot easier for the site's security team to spot this type of cheating. And that's going to be one of the countermeasures against this. We are relying on the room's security team because they have the broader perspective of all of the different types of hands a certain player has played. They have access to that player's hole card information in retrospect. So we are relying on the quality of the security team, and whether that's a favorable position to be in or not very likely depends on the site. One thing we've seen throughout history is that some poker sites care a lot more about whether there's cheating going on and are a lot more proactive about removing cheaters, whereas other sites don't really seem to care as much and will deliberately turn a blind eye to certain forms of cheating. It's worth keeping in mind that it's not always a big deal if there are players in our pool whom we can't beat. Perhaps they are cheating in some kind of way, making use of RTA. And let's just say we can't beat them, at least not after rake. It likely doesn't matter too much. That was probably never where a big percentage of our win rate was going to come from anyway. We just need to be aware of who these players are and understand that it's not really worth playing against them. It's not going to be profitable for us. The player pool is much larger than the small percentage of players who are making use of RTA. So the fact that RTA exists, and we know it does exist, RTA bots are being removed from various player pools all of the time. The fact that it exists doesn't preclude us from being able to make money at the poker tables. Okay, now honestly, this was just scratching the surface in terms of the different types of poker cheating activity. We could definitely talk about this for a lot longer. Hopefully it's opened your eyes to some of the different types of cheating that take place. And hopefully you'll be a bit more aware at the tables, just in case some type of cheating is occurring that's going to be affecting you negatively, you'll be able to maybe make a report to the security team or simply just stay away from that game. Thanks very much for listening. This was Coach Weasel, and this was the Red Chip Poker Podcast.